The rope groaned, a tired, old sound against the bite of the Montana wind. Jackson Blackwood didn't feel the cold. He stood on the rough-hewn platform. The world boiled down to this single moment. The hemp noose felt like a coarse collar, a final, scratchy reminder of his failure. Down below, the whole town of Redemption had gathered. They weren't cheering. They weren't jeering. They just watched, their faces grim, their collars pulled high against a cold that was more than just weather. It was the cold of hard justice in a hard land. Sheriff Thomas Holt, a man whose face was a roadmap of tough winters, put a gloved hand on the lever. That simple piece of wood and iron was the machine that would end Jackson's world. Holt's voice cut through the wind, loud and clear for the town record. Jackson Blackwood, you have been found guilty of theft and resisting arrest. The penalty is death by hanging. Have you any final words? Jackson's eyes were fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks lost in the snow-heavy clouds. He didn't see the mountains. He saw a cave. He saw a small, smoky fire. He saw his boys. Matthew, 8 years old, already too serious for his age, and Daniel, only 6, still young enough to believe his pa could fix anything. They were waiting for him, waiting for a father who was never coming home. A single thought burned through his mind. I failed them. I've nothing to say, Jackson said, his voice quiet but steady. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. Let's be done with it. Sheriff Holt nodded. His hand tightened on the lever. The crowd leaned in, a collective, morbid breath held in 100 chests. This was it. The final second. The drop. The snap. The end. Stop! The voice was like an axe splitting frozen timber. It shattered the silence. Every head in the square whipped around. The crowd parted, a human sea making way for a single figure. A woman, her dark cloak a stark contrast against the snow-covered ground. She was heavily pregnant, one hand supporting her swollen belly, the other clutching a piece of paper like a weapon. Eleanor Hayes. Her face was fierce, framed by strands of auburn hair that had escaped her bonnet. She wasn't afraid. She was a storm of a different kind. You cannot hang this man, she declared, her voice ringing with an authority that made even the sheriff pause. Sheriff Holt kept his hand on the lever, his brow furrowed in confusion. Ma'am, this is a lawful execution. Please, a step back. Eleanor didn't move. She winced, a brief flash of pain crossing her face, but she stood her ground. I invoke the Frontier Labor Act of 1871. She held up the folded document. This man can serve his sentence through indentured labor, not hanging. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Jackson's gaze finally tore away from the mountains. He stared at this woman, this complete stranger, and for the first time since his capture, a flicker of something he hadn't dared to feel sparked in his chest. Hope. That law is for debtors, ma'am, not thieves, the sheriff argued, but his voice had lost its conviction. He was starting to doubt. Section 4, paragraph 3, Eleanor shot back, her voice unwavering. It extends the provision to nonviolent criminals during times of territorial need. She took a step closer to the gallows. I have a homestead 7 miles from here. My husband died 3 months ago. I'm due any day, with no one to help me birth this child or work the land. She held the document out to the sheriff. I have the magistrate's seal from Pine Creek. This is legal, and it is binding. You could have heard a snowflake land in the town square. Jackson watched breathless as the sheriff reluctantly came down from the platform. He took the paper, his face a mask of skepticism. He read it slowly, his lips moving. The silence stretched. The whole town waited. Finally, the sheriff looked up, his face clouded with displeasure. It appears, he admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, to be in order. Then remove the noose from his neck, Eleanor demanded. And just like that, the world turned upside down. 1 minute, Jackson was staring into the abyss. The next, rough hands were unbinding him, pulling the scratchy rope from his neck. When his boots finally hit the hard-packed earth of the square, his legs almost gave out from under him. He was alive. He was breathing. He had no idea why. Eleanor approached him, her voice low, for his ears only. If you run, they'll find you, and they will hang you for real this time. Your only chance is with me. Jackson looked into her eyes, searching for a trick, a hidden motive, anything to explain this madness. He found nothing but grim determination. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He had no other choice. "Mrs. Hayes," the sheriff said, handing the document back to her. "He is your responsibility now. Any trouble, and it falls on your head." "I understand," Eleanor said, tucking the paper into her cloak. As they walked away from the gallows, the crowd parted for them, their silent stares feeling like a physical weight. Jackson had been ready to die. Now he was following a pregnant stranger into a future he couldn't begin to imagine. He was a dead man walking, saved by a miracle he didn't understand. And he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was far from over. Nothing, absolutely nothing, came for free in this land. The wagon ride was silent and brutal. Every rut in the frozen road sent a jolt through Jackson's body. Beside him, Eleanor Hayes handled the reins of a tired old mare, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. They hadn't spoken a word since leaving redemption behind. "We'll reach my place before nightfall," she finally said, breaking the silence. "It's not much, but my husband built it to last." Jackson couldn't stand it anymore. The question had been burning in his gut for miles. "Why?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor didn't look at him. "I told you, I need help. You need to not be hanging. Seemed like a fair trade." "There are other men in town," Jackson pressed. "Men who aren't thieves. Men who know how to farm." She gave him a quick sidelong glance. "And not a single one of them would come 7 miles out to a widow's homestead with a baby on the way and winter still biting at the door. They're afraid of being tied down, of the responsibility." She paused, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. "Besides, I've heard the stories. The mountain man with 2 small sons. A man like that knows how to survive. He knows what it is to be desperate." Jackson went rigid. "What else have you heard?" "That your wife died, that you keep to yourself," she said, guiding the horse around a snowdrift. "That before you came to these mountains, you were someone else entirely. But then," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "most everyone who comes west is running from something, aren't they?" The unspoken truth hung between them, thick and cold. She knew more than she was letting on. Way more. "My sons," Jackson said, the words forced out of him. "They're up in the mountains, in a cave. They don't have much food left." Eleanor just nodded, as if this was exactly what she expected to hear. "We'll get them." "I can go tonight," he said, urgency making his voice sharp. "I can take the horse and be back by morning." She finally turned to look at him, her expression firm. "And leave me here alone? 9 months pregnant, hours after I pulled you off the gallows?" "I may be desperate, Mr. Blackwood, but I am not a fool. You'll stay the night. You'll help with the chores. Tomorrow we will fetch your boys. Together." Jackson wanted to argue, to scream, to run. But he saw the steel in her gaze, and he knew she was right. If he ran, he'd be a fugitive again, and his boys would be alone forever. He was trapped. He had traded one kind of noose for another. "One night," he agreed, his voice a low growl. "Then I get my sons." As they crested a small hill, a homestead came into view. A sturdy log cabin, a barn, a chicken coop. It looked solid, safe. But something was wrong. Smoke was curling from the chimney. Someone was already there. Jackson's hand instinctively went to his side, searching for a knife that wasn't there. He was defenseless. Had he walked from one trap straight into another? "It's all right," Eleanor said, noticing his tension. "That'll be Ezekiel Reed, the preacher from town. He checks on me." As if on cue, the cabin door opened. A tall, thin man in a black coat stepped out onto the porch. His face was all sharp angles and a gray-streaked beard. He held a Bible in one hand like a shield. "Mrs. Hayes," the preacher called out. "I was beginning to worry." Then he saw Jackson, and he stopped dead. His friendly concern vanished, replaced by a look so intense it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't just surprise, it was recognition. A deep, unsettling recognition that went far beyond Jackson's reputation as a mountain thief. "I see you went through with it," the preacher said, his eyes locked on Jackson. "As we discussed, Ezekiel," Eleanor replied, climbing down from the wagon with difficulty. The preacher's gaze never left Jackson. It was like he was looking straight through him, seeing every secret he'd ever tried to bury. "Mr. Blackwood," Reed said, his voice careful, measured, "I trust you understand the opportunity you've been given." Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. This wasn't just a preacher checking on a widow. This was something else, something complicated and dangerous. What had they discussed? Who was this preacher? And more importantly, who did he think Jackson Blackwood really was? The preacher, Ezekiel Reed, was reluctant to leave. "I could stay the night," he offered, his eyes darting between Eleanor and Jackson. "Sleep in the barn, just to be safe." "There's no need," Eleanor said, her tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "Mr. Blackwood understands what's at stake. He won't cause any trouble." The preacher finally nodded, but as he mounted his horse and rode away, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the man had just sized him up for a coffin. He knew something that could get a man killed. The inside of the cabin was simple, clean, but with a lingering sense of loss. A layer of dust on the shelves, a rocking chair sitting perfectly still by the cold hearth. It was the home of a woman living alone, waiting. "Sit," Eleanor said, gesturing to a small table. "You look half-starved." But Jackson couldn't rest. "The horse," he said. "I need to tend to the horse first." It was an excuse. He needed a moment to think, to breathe air that wasn't thick with secrets. In the barn, the routine chores calmed him. The smell of hay and animals was familiar, honest. He worked quickly, his mind racing. Who was Eleanor Hayes? Why go to such lengths to save a stranger? And what was her connection to that preacher? It was a puzzle, and he was the missing piece they were trying to force into place. When he returned, a pot of stew was bubbling over the fire, filling the cabin with a rich aroma that made his empty stomach ache. Eleanor was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands resting on her belly. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You have questions," she said. It wasn't a question. "So do I," he replied. "But you're right. First we eat." They ate in silence. The stew was the best thing Jackson had tasted in months. It was food that hadn't been stolen, a warmth that wasn't just from a fire. It felt dangerous. It felt like hope. "Your boys," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "Tell me about them." Jackson found himself talking, the words spilling out of him. He told her about Matthew, so serious and steady, about Daniel, full of light and laughter. He even told her about their mother, Sarah, how she'd died bringing Daniel into the world. It was more than he'd told anyone in 3 years. He didn't know why he was telling her. Maybe it was the stew, or maybe it was the look in her eyes, a deep, quiet understanding that felt older than the mountains. "There's a pallet in the storeroom," she said when he was done. "Blankets in the chest. It's warmer than a jail cell." "Or a noose," he added quietly. A small, tired smile touched her lips. Indeed. Later, lying in the dark storeroom, Jackson couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound. He thought about his boys, alone in that cave. He had to get to them. He could slip out now, take the horse, be there by sunrise, but something held him back. It was the debt. This woman had saved his life. She was alone, vulnerable, and about to have a child. Running would make him the man the town of Redemption thought he was. A thief, a coward. But staying felt like walking deeper into a trap he couldn't see. He had no idea how right he was, because in the main room, long after she thought he was asleep, Eleanor Hayes was not resting. She knelt by the hearth, prying up a loose floorboard. From the hidden space beneath, she pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a bundle of letters. She pulled one out, her fingers tracing the faded ink. The words were a ghost's whisper in the quiet cabin. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began. "The hospital is a nightmare, but there are moments of grace. Today I assisted Dr. Blackwood with a chest wound. The man should have died. Any other surgeon would have lost him. But Dr. Blackwood? He is a miracle worker. He doesn't just see wounds. He sees the men. He fights for every single one. I am learning more from him than any textbook could teach me. He is a great man, Eleanor. A truly great man." She carefully folded the letter, written by her dead husband, James. a medical assistant in the war, a man who had worked alongside one of the Union Army's most brilliant surgeons, Dr. Nathan Blackwood. She had recognized him the second she saw him on that gallows, older, beaten down by life, hiding behind a new name. But it was him, the man her husband had admired above all others. The idea to use the Labor Act hadn't been hers. It had been the preacher's. A doctor, even one in hiding, Ezekiel had said, his eyes gleaming with a strange light, would be a godsend in this territory. Eleanor put the letter away, a sharp pain tightening across her belly. The baby was getting restless. The time was coming. She placed a hand over her womb, her secret a heavy weight inside her. She hadn't just saved a thief from the gallows. She had claimed a legend, and she hadn't told him that she knew. She hadn't told him that his past was about to come crashing down on them all. She had a plan, a desperate, dangerous plan, and Jackson Blackwood was standing right in the middle of it. The climb was hell. Snowdrifts came up to his waist, and the air was so thin and cold it burned his lungs with every breath. But Jackson didn't slow down. He pushed on, driven by a fear that was colder than any winter wind. Had he been too late? Were his boys? He finally saw it, a dark slash in the white face of the mountain. The cave. "Matthew!" he yelled, his voice swallowed by the vast, silent landscape. "Daniel!" Silence. A dead, horrifying silence. His heart hammered against his ribs. He scrambled the last few yards, slipping on icy rocks, and plunged into the darkness of the cave. His eyes took a moment to adjust. The fire pit was a circle of cold, gray ash. Their small bundle of belongings was there, undisturbed. But the boys were gone. "Matthew!" His voice was a raw, desperate sound, echoing off the stone walls. "Daniel!" Nothing. Just the echo of his own terror. He had failed. He had gotten himself caught. He'd wasted a day, and now his sons were gone. Taken by wolves or wandered off into the snow or worse. The weight of it crushed him. He sank to his knees, the cold of the rock seeping into his bones. Then he heard it, a tiny sound, a muffled sob coming from deeper in the cave. From a narrow crevice he'd shown Matthew, a hiding place for emergencies. "Pa?" The voice was a whisper, small and shaky with fear. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He crawled towards the sound, his hands numb, his body trembling with relief. "Matthew, it's me, son. It's Pa. It's safe." A small figure emerged from the darkness, blinking in the faint light. Matthew? His face was thin, his eyes huge in his gaunt face, but he was alive. Behind him, a smaller shadow appeared. Daniel. "Pa!" Daniel launched himself out of the crevice and into Jackson's arms, his little body shaking with sobs. "You came back. We thought. Jackson crushed both of them to his chest, burying his face in their tangled hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and innocence. He held them tight, trying to pour all his love, all his regret, all his promises into that one embrace. "I'm here," he whispered, his own voice thick with tears. "I promised, didn't I? I always come back." He had found them. They were alive. But as he looked at their thin faces, at the way their worn shirts hung off their small frames, he knew the danger was far from over. Their food was gone. They had been surviving on melted snow and sheer will. A few more days and he would have been too late. The journey down the mountain was slow. Daniel, too weak to walk far, rode on Jackson's back. Matthew followed, his small hand gripping the back of his father's coat, not letting go, as if he was afraid his pa might disappear again. When they finally reached the spot where he'd left Eleanor, the sun was a fiery orange orb sinking behind the peaks. She was standing by the wagon, wrapped in blankets, a small fire crackling beside her. She looked up as they approached, and her face, so hard and determined before, softened. Jackson saw Matthew tense up beside him. The boy had learned to be wary of everyone. "Mrs. Hayes," Jackson called out, "these are my sons, Matthew and Daniel." Eleanor smiled, a real warm smile that seemed to chase away some of the mountain chill. "Hello, Matthew. Hello, Daniel. I'm very glad to finally meet you." Daniel, always the more trusting of the two, gave a shy little wave. Matthew just stared, his eyes full of suspicion. "I saved some stew for you," Eleanor said, gesturing to a pot by the fire. I figured you'd be hungry. At the word food, the boys' suspicion evaporated. They ate like starving wolves, their small hands shaking as they lifted the spoons to their mouths. Jackson watched them, a painful lump in his throat. This woman, this stranger, had not only saved his life, she was now feeding his children. The debt he owed her was growing with every passing second. And debt in this land was always paid, one way or another. The ride back to the homestead was a blur of exhaustion. The boys fell asleep in the back of the wagon, huddled together under the blankets. As they arrived, a bitter wind picked up, driving the first flakes of a new storm before it. A blizzard's coming, Eleanor said, her voice tight with concern. We got back just in time. Inside the warm cabin, she made a bed for the boys by the fire. As Jackson tucked them in, watching their faces finally relax in sleep, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. This wasn't his home. This wasn't his life. He was a mountain man, a fugitive. What was he doing here? Playing house with a pregnant widow. When he looked up, he found Eleanor watching him, her expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Thank you, he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. She just nodded. Then she winced, her hand flying to her belly, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the back of a chair. Are you all right? Jackson asked, moving towards her, concern overriding his confusion. Just tired, she breathed, but he could see the sheen of sweat on her forehead. Before he could press her, a furious gust of wind rattled the windows. The snow was coming down thick and fast now, a swirling white curtain erasing the world outside. I should check the animals, he said, heading for the door. Make sure the barn is secure. Hurry back, she said, easing herself into the rocking chair. This feels like a bad one. Outside the storm was a living thing, a roaring, white monster. He fought his way to the barn, the wind tearing at his clothes. He secured the doors, checked on the mare, made sure the chickens were safe. As he turned to head back to the cabin, a movement at the edge of the tree line caught his eye. Through the swirling snow he saw it, a rider on a horse, a dark, still silhouette half hidden in the pines, watching the cabin. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the preacher, Reed. But there was something different about this figure, something predatory. The rider sat perfectly still, a patient hunter observing its prey. Then, as if sensing he'd been seen, the figure turned and vanished back into the blizzard. A cold dread, far worse than the storm's chill, washed over Jackson. He ran back to the cabin, his heart pounding, and bolted the door behind him. What is it? Eleanor asked, seeing the look on his face. Nothing, he lied, not wanting to scare her. Just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. But he knew it wasn't a trick. He'd spent 3 years looking over his shoulder. He knew what it felt like to be hunted. Someone had found them, trapped in a blizzard, with a pregnant woman about to go into labor, and 2 small boys. Someone was out there in the storm, and they weren't there to offer help. The blizzard raged for 2 solid days, trapping them in the small cabin like animals in a den. The world shrank to the 4 log walls, the crackling fire, and the constant, howling scream of the wind. Jackson fell into a routine, chopping wood, tending the animals, making small repairs around the cabin. It was a strange kind of domestic peace, and it terrified him. It felt like a trap. On the second night, as the storm finally began to lose its fury, the truth came out. They were sitting by the fire. The boys were asleep in the storeroom. Eleanor was mending a shirt, her needle flashing in the firelight. You knew, Jackson said, the words coming out of nowhere. You knew who I was, before the hanging. Eleanor didn't look up from her sewing. The only sound was the pop of the fire and the whisper of the wind. A long minute passed. Then she sighed, a deep, weary sound. I was a nurse during the war, she said softly, her voice barely audible, at a field hospital near Atlanta. My husband, James, was a medical assistant. She finally looked at him, her eyes clear and direct in the dim light. You were a surgeon there, Dr. Nathan Blackwood, the best surgeon in the whole Union Army. The name hit him like a punch to the gut, a name he had buried 3 years ago, a life he had torched and run from. How? He started to ask, but he already knew. It was all clicking into place. The preacher, her strange confidence, the carefully planned rescue. James wrote about you in his letters, she continued. He admired you. He said you were a hero. She paused, her gaze dropping to her swollen belly. So when they brought a thief named Jackson Blackwood to the gallows, a man with haunted eyes in the hands of a surgeon, I knew, and I couldn't let them hang you. He felt the floor drop out from under him. His whole reality had just been rewritten. She hadn't saved a random stranger out of pity. She had saved a memory, a ghost. So this whole thing, he said, his voice dangerously low, the Labor Act, bringing me here, it was all a lie. It was a desperation, she corrected, for both of us. Before he could process the full weight of her confession, a sharp, sudden knock echoed through the cabin. 3 hard raps on the door. It wasn't the wind. Jackson was on his feet in an instant, the knife he'd been using to whittle a toy for Daniel in his hand. Every instinct screamed danger. Who's there? He called out, his body tensed, ready to fight. Ezekiel Reed, a muffled voice replied. I've come to check on Mrs. Hayes. Jackson glanced at Eleanor. She gave a slight nod. He unbolted the door and opened it just a crack. The preacher stood there, covered in snow, his face grim. He wasn't alone. Standing just behind him was another man, a stranger with a hard face and the unmistakable look of a lawman. Reed pushed his way inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He wasn't looking at Eleanor. He was looking at Jackson. I brought news from town, the preacher said, pulling a folded newspaper from his coat. He handed it to Jackson. The headline was stark and brutal. It leaped off the page and strangled the air from his lungs. Prominent Illinois jurist arrives in redemption to oversee territorial cases. Beneath the headline was a sketch, a face from his nightmares, a face he had spent 3 years running from, the face of the man who had sworn on his son's grave that he would see Nathan Blackwood hang. Judge Maxwell Reynolds. He was here. He had found him. He's asking questions, Reed said, his voice a low rumble, about a mountain man, a man with 2 young sons. The trap had just been sprung, but the nightmare was only beginning, because at that exact moment, a small voice came from the storeroom door. It was Matthew. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Pa, he whispered, his voice trembling. Daniel's sick. He's real sick. He can't breathe. It was a perfect storm. The past had arrived on his doorstep. His son was dying, and the walls of the cabin, which had felt like a shelter just moments before, now felt like a tomb. There was no escape. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying point, his son's ragged breathing. Jackson forgot the judge. He forgot the storm. He was no longer Jackson the fugitive. He was Nathan the doctor. He flew across the room, pushing past Matthew into the cold storeroom. Daniel was burning up. His small chest hitched with every shallow, desperate gasp for air. His face was flushed with fever. His lips had a terrifying bluish tinge. Pneumonia, a killer of children. Get me boiled water, he barked, his voice sharp with command. Clean linens, and mustard. Do you have mustard? Eleanor was already moving, her own discomfort forgotten. James kept medical supplies, she said, hurrying to a large wooden chest. He was a doctor's assistant. He knew what to keep. The preacher, Reed, knelt beside him. You know what to do, don't you? He said, his voice quiet but intense. You can save him, Dr. Blackwood. Jackson's head snapped up. He met the preacher's gaze. The secret was out. All of it. But none of that mattered now. Only Daniel mattered. The next few hours were a frantic, desperate battle. Nathan worked with a speed and focus he hadn't known he still possessed. His hands, calloused from years of mountain life, became surgeon's hands again. Steady, precise, sure. He mixed a mustard plaster to break up the congestion in Daniel's lungs. He brewed a tea from willow bark to fight the fever. He and Eleanor worked side by side, a seamless team, fighting to pull his son back from the brink. Through it all, a single thought echoed in his mind. If I had been hanged, he would be dead. The debt he owed Eleanor wasn't just his life anymore. It was his son's. By dawn, the crisis had passed. The fever broke. Daniel's breathing, while still shallow, was easier, more regular. He was sleeping, a real, healing sleep. Nathan sat by his side, utterly exhausted, watching the small rise and fall of his son's chest. Eleanor came to him, a cup of coffee in her hand. Her face was pale, drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were full of a deep, quiet respect. Nathan, she said, using his real name for the first time. It sounded strange, like a word from another language. I think it's time you told me the real story. Why did you run? Why is Judge Reynolds hunting you? And so he told her. He told her everything. About the night the judge's son, crazed and desperate for morphine, had broken into their home. About the struggle, the knife, the terror of protecting his pregnant wife, Sarah. He threatened her, Nathan said, his voice a raw whisper. I was trying to get the knife away from him. I never meant to. I never meant to kill him. He told her how Judge Reynolds, a man driven mad by grief, had used his power to twist self-defense into murder. How he had been forced to take his newborn son Daniel and a terrified Matthew and flee into the night, disappearing into the mountains to become someone else. As he finished, a new sound cut through the quiet cabin, a sharp, pained gasp. Nathan looked up. Eleanor was gripping the doorframe, her face contorted in pain. Eleanor! She looked at him, a strange, grim smile on her lips. I think, she said through gritted teeth, as another wave of pain washed over her, that this baby has decided it doesn't want to wait any longer. His training took over instantly. The fear for his son, the dread of the judge, all of it was pushed aside by a new urgent crisis. He helped her to her bed, his mind racing. Reed, he yelled. Wake Matthew! I need more water boiled. I need all the clean linens you can find. The blizzard still howled outside. Judge Reynolds was in town, closing his net. His youngest son was weak with pneumonia, and now he had to deliver a baby. He was trapped in a cabin in the middle of a storm, surrounded by life and death, with his past and future all about to collide. I don't suppose, Eleanor gasped, gripping his hand with impossible strength, that you delivered many babies as an army surgeon? Despite everything, a rough smile touched Nathan's lips. A few, he said, though never in quite these circumstances. Well, she panted, her eyes locking with his. Good thing you didn't hang then. The baby came into the world with a furious, healthy cry, a defiant scream against the storm and the darkness. A girl. Eleanor named her Hope. As Nathan cleaned the small, perfect infant and placed her in her mother's arms, he felt a dizzying sense of whiplash. In the space of 12 hours, he had faced down death, saved one child, and brought another into the world. He was exhausted, bone deep and soul deep. The moment of peace was shattered by a knock at the door. Not a desperate plea for help, but a hard official rap. Reed opened it to reveal the sheriff's young deputy, his face numb with cold. He wasn't looking at the new mother or the sleeping children. He was looking at Nathan. He held out a single folded piece of paper. A summons, the deputy said, his voice flat. From Judge Reynolds. You are to present yourself at the town hall tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock to answer for the crime of murder. The air in the makeshift courtroom was thick with 100 years of dust and the bitter scent of frontier justice. Every bench was packed. The whole town of Redemption had turned out to see the final act of this strange drama. Nathan stood before a large wooden desk, his two sons standing just behind him, their small hands gripping the back of his coat. Across the room, Eleanor sat with the preacher, holding baby Hope wrapped tightly in a blanket. She looked tired, but her eyes were fixed on Nathan, a silent message of support passing between them. But Nathan wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the man behind the desk, Judge Maxwell Reynolds. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a grief that had curdled into pure, undiluted vengeance. Dr. Nathan Blackwood, the judge's voice boomed, filling the silent hall. You stand accused of the murder of my son, Thomas Reynolds. You fled justice for 3 years. The time for running is over. How do you plead? Not guilty, Nathan said, his voice clear and steady, by reason of self-defense. A gasp went through the crowd. Reynolds slammed a gavel on the desk, the sound like a gunshot. Self-defense? My son was unarmed when you butchered him in your home. Your son was armed with a knife, Nathan countered, his voice rising. He broke into my home. He threatened my pregnant wife. I did what any man would do. I protected my family. Lies, Reynolds roared, his judicial composure cracking. The convenient story of a coward who ran rather than face the consequences of his actions. It was happening, just as he'd feared. This wasn't a hearing, it was a performance, a show trial, and he was the main event. Reynolds was going to railroad him, using the full weight of the law to crush him. But then something unexpected happened. The preacher, Ezekiel Reed, stood up. "If it pleases the court," Reed said, his voice calm but carrying an iron authority, "I have evidence that is pertinent to this case." Reynolds sneered. And what evidence could a backwater preacher possibly have about a murder that took place 3 years ago, 1,000 miles from here? "I don't have evidence about the murder, Judge," Reed said, his eyes locking with Reynolds. "I have evidence about you, about your conduct during the war." The room went dead silent. Reynolds's face went pale. "I have evidence," Reed continued, his voice like the tolling of a bell, "of an order you gave to attack a civilian settlement, an order that resulted in the deaths of women and children, an order you then covered up, falsifying reports and blaming the massacre on Confederate forces." The judge looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "This is outrageous. Slander. It has no bearing on this case." "It has every bearing," a new voice cut in. Eleanor had stood up, her voice ringing with a strength that belied the fact she had given birth less than 2 days ago. "My late husband, James Hayes, served under your command, Judge. He was the medical assistant who witnessed the aftermath of your orders. He was a man of conscience. He couldn't participate in your cover-up." She held up a worn leather portfolio. "So he documented it, everything. The orders, the falsified reports, sworn statements from other soldiers who were too afraid to speak out. He kept it all." The portfolio in her hand was not just paper and ink. It was a bomb, and she had just lit the fuse. Reynolds was sputtering, his face a mottled purple. "Blackmail? This is a conspiracy. This is the truth." Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. "And it establishes a pattern of a man who abuses his power, who twists the truth to serve his own ends. A man who is not fit to sit in judgment of anyone, least of all the man who defended his family from your own violent, addicted son." The room exploded into chaos. Reynolds was banging his gavel, screaming for order, but it was too late. The story was out. His perfect, righteous facade had been shattered. Then a tall figure who had been standing quietly against the back wall stepped forward. U.S. Marshal Garrett. "Judge," the marshal said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I think you have a choice to make. You can continue with this personal vendetta, and I can take this portfolio of evidence back to my superiors in Helena. They are very interested in the full and complete history of our federal judges." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "Or you can dismiss this case, and we can all agree that justice, in all its forms, has been served today." Checkmate. Reynolds stared at the marshal, at Eleanor holding the evidence, at Nathan standing tall and unbroken before him. He saw the faces of the townspeople. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to suspicion and disgust. He was beaten. His vengeance had turned to ash in his mouth. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stood there, a broken man. The rage drained out of him, replaced by a deep, hollow emptiness. Finally he spoke, his voice a dead monotone. "This court finds insufficient evidence to proceed. Case dismissed." He didn't look at Nathan. He couldn't. He turned and strode from the room, a man stripped of his power and his purpose. A wave of relief so powerful it almost knocked Nathan off his feet washed over him. It was over. 3 years of running, 3 years of looking over his shoulder. It was finally, truly over. He turned and looked at his new, strange, beautiful family. Eleanor, fierce and strong, the woman who had faced down a corrupt judge with nothing but the truth. His sons who had been through so much, now looking at him with awe and pride. And baby Hope, a tiny symbol of a future he never thought he'd have. The town of redemption had almost been the end of him. Instead, it was a beginning. He was no longer Jackson the fugitive. He was Dr. Nathan Blackwood. And for the first time in a very long time, he was home. But the biggest decision of his life was still waiting for him. The town council had made him an offer: a house, a salary, a clinic, a chance to be their doctor, a chance to reclaim his old life. It was everything he thought he wanted. But as he looked at Eleanor, standing there in the dusty town hall, he realized his old life was gone. He didn't want to rebuild what he'd lost. He wanted to build something new, something with her. He walked over to her, his heart pounding harder than it had when he was facing the judge. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, "that conversation we started before all this madness, the one that kept getting interrupted." She looked up at him, a small, hopeful smile playing on her lips. "Yes? I was going to ask you," he said, taking her free hand in his. "I know this is fast. I know this is crazy. We have barely known each other a month, but in that month you've saved my life. You've saved my son, and you've shown me what it means to be brave. You've brought hope back into my life in more ways than one." He took a deep breath. "The town council offered me a house, a big one, plenty of room for a doctor, and his family." He looked from her to Matthew, to Daniel, to the baby in her arms. "I don't want to be their doctor unless you'll be my wife. Marry me, Eleanor. All of us. Let's be a family." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy. "Nathan Blackwood," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought you'd never ask." The church bells of redemption began to ring, not for an execution, but for a wedding. Spring had come to the mountains, and with it, a new beginning. They had faced down death, lies, and the ghosts of the past. Together, they had found their own kind of justice, their own kind of peace. On a quiet ridge overlooking the town that had once condemned him, Nathan and his new family built a home. They called it Redemption Ridge, not because of the town below, but because it was the place where they had all, in their own way, been redeemed. If you enjoyed the story of justice and second chances, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss the incredible tales we have coming next.